back in the book, and we'll also look at quite a few of the ground feeding birds, the bigger generalist ground feeding birds. So everyone's got a book. You've all got a field guide to look at. If someone else wants one, would you like one?
We've got them looking now.
Yep.
Get on with the job.
Yep. I like, particularly with these, it suddenly makes you look at the bird in a different way. So if you see the crest from the side, you can usually pick the bird a mile away, but suddenly that makes you aware of those patterns that you're seeing on the wing coverts, which you can quite easily ignore. So what page are we on? 53?
53?
Up the top. You can't see the red around the more.
Another one of those sort of calls. Type of call you can hear in the background. Yep. And then that wing flap that's very distinctive. You can hear a mile away. Okay. A lot of people locally call them top knots. And if you look in your book at the top knot pigeon, you'll see it's an East Coast bird. And it wears a turban, which is the top knot. So if you're starting to fill in bird observations when we come to show you how to put data into the data portal, if you type in top knot, you won't actually get anything because top knots are not a pigeon that are found locally. So you would need to use the name that's in your book, the common name, the main one that's in your book. Just be aware of things like that. So if you're typing in top knot, don't contact me straight away. Have a look in the book and check out what the name is in the book and try that one, see if that works. If that doesn't work, then check that it's found in this part of the world. And if you're really confident, then give us a yell and we'll track down what the mistake is. Okay, but those particular feathers, they're actually quite distinctive. You don't see them because you see the metallic colouring on the wings, or you see the crest. So, crested pigeon. Now this guy, it's in a group of birds that lay their eggs in other birds' nests. The adults, depending on the species, may kick the eggs out of the other bird, or the young, when they hatch within 24, 36 hours, they'll grab the egg. Some get the egg on the top of their neck and they just push it up over and out of the nest. They have a very different way of living. And then they con the other species to feed them. And typically the sorts of species they're working with are much, much smaller. So this particular cuckoo, it's parasitising fairy wrens and thornbill nests. It's much bigger than those birds. Some cuckoos, the adults will incidentally feed the young ones later on when they're out, and they'll bring food to them. The cuckoos can be very demanding, and even birds flying past will come over and feed them. So the cuckoo chicks, because of the nature of their call, they're demanding enough to get other birds to come and feed them. Then the part that I'm really intrigued by, most of these never see their parents again. So they're migratory. So they fly away up north, they come back here, and suddenly they're doing what all cuckoos do. So a lot of it must be genetic. So they're not learning these behaviours, they're just naturally doing them. When we're looking at cuckoos, there's two major groups. One group has this very distinctive shape, and most of them have quite lovely colouring in the wings. Then, once you've worked out which group it is, then you're looking at stripes through the eye and the colouring on the head, and you're looking at banding on the breast and belly. And sometimes it's whether or not the bands actually meet in the middle or have a white line down through the middle of them. But the main way you'll identify them is from the call, because they're not always easily seen, and they're quite secretive, and they fly off. They'll avoid you. Now, thinking about that call, what's it actually doing? Think about the way the call sounds. So you've got individual, it's descending, but the call, it's descending and along, and then it starts again. It just repeats the same call. Okay? So you can start to picture that call. And then there's a little tweet at the end. Chirps at the end. So,
It could be similar to that thing I can hear.
yeah?
It could be similar to that.
That's what I first thought when you started describing the call. So, Horsfield's bronze cuckoo, that's the adult. The juvenile's a bit trickier, much plainer. Yeah. But the interesting part is you'll see some big bird like that, and you'll have little blue wrens either side of it, all buzzing around feeding it. And somehow these blue wrens make an amazing big bird that comes back and parasitises them next year. And it's really interesting. Some of them will, they'll come in and they'll lay the egg while the male's distracting them, the host. Others will very secretively move around. It's quite amazing to watch. I saw one in Africa that was parasitising a pied crow over there, which is quite a large bird. And the male was in front of the pied crow on the nest, and the female came up through her legs, laid the egg, and flew off. And then, yeah, things like that where there's all sorts of neat little things going on. Often birds will abandon their nests if the adult if the cuckoo lays an egg in their nest before they've laid their own eggs, they'll just abandon it. And there's all sorts of neat competitions going on. So, for example, the way that ecologists think about a lot of this stuff is in the evolutionary sense, and there's competition between two species. So if the cuckoos totally won, there would not be any of these other species here. If the other species all detected the cuckoo's eggs and pushed them out of the nest or the young, then there would not be any cuckoos there. So those are two extremes which are not happening. But at the same time, these birds are each aware of the other one, and they know what's going on in a way. And so there's a competition. And we talk about the Red Queen idea. So if you remember Alice in Wonderland, the Red Queen talked about how you had to go faster and faster just in order to stay in one place. And it's the same with these guys. They're each competing with each other. And some years one's more successful than the others, other years the other's more successful. And it's about the eggs and their similarity. It's about the way in which they manage to con the adult in their begging behaviours. A whole suite of things that are going on that really are quite intriguing. Understanding that is not easy.
How do they fit into the thornbill nest? About pretty small.
Yeah, and there's really complex things going on. So if you've got the yellow rump thornbill, they build a lovely little nest on top with another nest underneath, and the one underneath, it's got a little side entrance, and that's actually where they lay their eggs. And if you play a cuckoo call nearby, they'll jump out of the bottom nest and jump up into the top nest. So they're pretending to be up in the top nest and get the cuckoos to lay their eggs there, whereas they're actually laying their own eggs down in the bottom nest. So there's all sorts of neat things going on with how they build their nests and how they manage to protect their eggs and their young.
All cuckoos do that.
Yeah, the cuckoos as a group. There may be exceptions in other countries, but yeah, as far as I know, yeah, they all parasitise. So, Horsfield's bronze cuckoo, and remember with the cuckoos, you're sorting out, can you see the two pages? One of them has really lovely metallic coloration in their wings, that physical coloration that we talked about, and others are much plainer and they've got sort of different body shapes. So we're going from the bronze cuckoos, and the other groups are more the fantail cuckoos and ones like that. Okay, one of the bigger ground birds. They are different. Yep. You found him?
Would he be grey currawong?
Yeah.
Grey belly. The first one I saw was over in Western Australia. Grey currawong. The heck they do. I've never seen one before. But yeah, the yellow eye makes me motivated.
Yeah. Now, there's many different subspecies of the grey currawong. which is this one. Some of them are grey, which is where the name comes from, but then others are quite dark, almost black. So telling them apart, the different subspecies is about different shades and where they are in Australia. The one that they easily get confused with, and we don't have here, it starts right down the southeast and in Victoria, and is across through along the east coast of Australia. That's the pied currawong. Have a look at the pied currawong.
I thought we had them at the golf course.
The chuffs are happy about it. Have a look at the pied currawong.
Yeah, oh yeah, the call.
They've got a white band across their rump. So in flight, you can pick them by the white band across their rump.
Remember sitting there.
So when you're in Victoria, you actually start to need to look at them to tell them apart from the grey currawong. The grey currawong, it's called that really nice, clear clink. But the pied currawong, the black one's in Tassie. So, grey currawongs, it's not so much about their colour or the greyness of them, because as you move across Australia, you get into different subspecies and they're no longer grey. And if you look back at the very old books, they even have them sometimes as separate species. And then pied currawong is the key one that you've got to tell them apart from. And that becomes a problem as you get down to the bottom of South Australia and across through Victoria and along the east coast. And then you hear differences in calls, but notice that you get that lovely little bit of white across the rump for the pied currawong. Can all see that? Yep.
The one that comes to my garden is a lot darker than that.
Yeah, ones I've got are darker too. And also the cry is really a lot louder. You can hear it.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a lovely call. Which group? Doves and pigeons?
You probably won't. You won't get one. That's it. There's heaps of them around.
You've got a really low pitched type of call again. You hear that? The challenge with bronzewings on our peninsula is we have two of them, the common and the brush. And if you look at their heads, you can sort of slowly work out to tell them apart. But the key thing that allows you to identify them quickly is to look on the back of the necks and the shoulder of the bird. And you'll notice one is grey and the other one is that beautiful brown. Now, there's a few challenges there. So, that's a common bronzewing. Can you see what sex it is from the colouring, the subtleties of that colouring? It's a male. Okay. And then, one of the things that we want to get you to think about again, remember we talked about the different ways you can get colouring in the feathers. So there was the melanins, which gave you the blacks and the browns, and then there were the carotenoids, gave you the yellows, oranges and reds, and then we had the physical coloration, and there were two types of that, one that gave you the blues and then the other one that gave you the metallic sort of effects, and that was about whether or not the waves interacted with each other and cancelled each other out. And so at particular angles they were black through to colour through to black again. When the waves were exactly coming in and going out and cancelling each other out, you got the black. When they were adding to each other, you got that intense effect of the colour. So remember that. Some angles will give you the really powerful colour and other angles won't.
Are they two different sexes, those two though?
I think they are, yep. One of the things that's tricky, if you're looking for the brown on the top of the neck, both the species, when they take off, have the beautiful underwing coverts are brown. So you don't get confused by that. If you're driving down to Port Lincoln and you're seeing all the bronzewings feeding on the side of the roads on the grain from the grain trucks, you can identify them based on the brown on the neck, unless they're a juvenile. That's a bit trickier. We'll talk about that. But for the adults, it's either grey on the back there or it's brown. But if you see the brown as they take off, make sure you're looking at the neck, not under the wing. And you can see they both have the brown under the wing. No, different species. Like all the other cuckoos, they're migratory. So they start to turn up here late winter. These guys are a bit later than the others. I think they migrate further up into the islands out into the Pacific. But when they do get here, suddenly you start hearing their calls. And that's from the late winter on. And you'll hear the calls right through into the summer, and then they'll disappear again. So with this guy, again, they're pretty secretive. Notice it tails off towards the end. So you've got okay. Runs out of battery, yeah. But very distinct from the Horsfield's bronze cuckoo that we were listening to before, which kept that same descending call all the way through. Each of the notes was the same. Or not notes, each of the elements was the same. Okay, so migratory wooded habitats. Notice again, they're picking on smaller birds. They like enclosed nests, things like thornbills, georgines, scrub wrens, heath wrens, fairy wrens, and the dome nest of things like honeyeaters and robins.
The other one, shining on.
And
Red eye as well. Oh yeah. Oh no.
so you're all happy with shining bronze cuckoo?
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah, there's no red in the tail.
Have a look in the flight, and where the banding stops. So, and then the challenge again is juveniles versus adults. So juveniles, particularly when comparing juvenile Horsfield's bronze to the shining bronze. When you look at the Horsfield bronze cuckoo, the bands on the belly don't meet. Whereas with the shining bronze, if you see it straight on, the bands on the belly meet. Oh, wow. Where's Ben gone? Yeah? Yeah. Okay. Have a break. Good. It's very similar to the black-faced cuckoo-shrike that we often see here. No, but close. Yeah.
That's right, I was reading that label, but
That's better.
that one.
Yes. Yep.
The brown cuckoo-shrike.
Page 403. Don't see them down south on EP, but up north you do. Not very often though. They have really distinctive flight and call. I'll play the call for you. But they're a strong bird on the ground. They have very definite movement across the ground. There's a crow in the background. That sounds much more like the black-faced cuckoo-shrike. Okay. A ground cuckoo-shrike. Yeah.
Yeah, we used to see the when we
Oh, sorry, that one. That's the one I was looking at, but I looked at that name. I'm with you.
Yep. So in Spinifex country, that part of the world, woodlandy areas, and you often get them in small flocks. But the one we see in our part of the world is the black-faced cuckoo-shrike.
we used to see them when we first moved to our house in Bishop Road.
Yep.
They're gone
Ah, the black-faced cuckoo-shrike again is very distinctive in its flight.
Yeah, that's right. The heading stuff there. Yeah. Yeah, we used to see them all the time, but not anymore.
Now you should be starting to recognise that head shape and bill shape. It's got a bit of a curved bill, a little bit like a honeyeater, but it's not. Sort of wider and shorter. And the head's much rounder than the honeyeaters, or bigger. You're looking far too relaxed, Ben Smith. That's a cuckoo. Yep. It is a cuckoo. Remember I said there were two groups of cuckoos? We're looking at our maps and remembering which ones are found here. Yep. So we're not looking at each little element being a descending part. They're going up. All good. Again, migratory. Woodlands, open shrublands. They like hosts that have open cup-shaped nests, so honeyeaters, flycatchers, wood swallows, whistlers.
So do they have, like, is there a black, all that black is an eye, is it?
Yeah, and then there's a ring around the outside.
Is there a black ring inside the yellow ring? Or is that all that black is eye?
Eye, yeah.
Because there seems to be huge eyes.
I think that's skin colour around the outside of the eye. Is,
The
yeah.
yellow part?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I just mean the black part seems to be really big.
Yeah, I thought that was probably one.
Again, quite secretive. They don't like you walking towards them. They'll fly off and disappear behind bushes and that. So often what you hear is what allows you to identify them, not what you see. You will get looks at them, but they are a little bit more secretive. And when they're calling, often they're calling for a mate, so they've got a nest located, and they're working with a mate to pair up. And so pallid cuckoo, all happy with that? Yep.
Little babblers, 394. Yeah. Seen them up in Ocean Avenue. Whole family. it's the whole. Hang on, no. Oh, no. Oh yeah, look at blue. It's a white brown.
The only place you can
Somewhere.
have a challenge is as you approach Port Augusta, and then you get another species comes into play as well. So look at the one that you'd find at Port Augusta, and look at the one that you find on EP. There's only one on EP proper. Yep, so that's the white-browed. And then, as you go across towards Port Augusta and north of Port Augusta, you get the chestnut crowned appearing. Look at the coverts on the wings of the chestnut crowned, and they've got that little terminal band on each of the feathers that gives you those two white lines across the wings. If you see the two white lines, well, you know it's not a white-browed. So the white-browed can have a white brow like the chestnut crown, but the chestnut crown, it's not always that easy to see, particularly when the bird's in the bushes and you know there's no light on it. But as soon as you see those two white flashes on the wing, you can tell them apart. If you're heading into the botanical gardens at Port Augusta, you'll get different babblers there.
Question for you, Greg. Another question. We used to call them hopping guineas, right?
Hopping guineas? I have heard that name before, yeah. Hopping guineas, okay.
Don't ask where they come from, but that's...
Well, someone...
They were hopping guineas when I was a kid up there too.
Yeah. Someone came up with the name. The RAOU, Royal Australasian Ornithological Union, as what's called BirdLife Australia now, used to be known as, they had a few meetings in the early 20th century where they tried to come up with a common name for each bird. You can imagine the arguments. I happened to be at a Mammal Society meeting in the early 80s where they were trying to come up with common names, and the arguments there were quite phenomenal as well. That's one of those things that's close to the heart. If you grew up calling it a piping thrush or whatever, then that's what they are. Okay, so white-browed babbler, all good? And just be aware of the wings. If you can see the wings, to tell them apart. Notice the absence of the colour in the wing. See where it's black? At this particular angle, those two, the wave coming in and the wave going out, are cancelling each other out. So if you changed your angle a bit, you'd probably get the colour suddenly appearing. Brush bronze wing, so it's got the brown on the neck and the back. Which sex is it? It's probably a female because it's actually not got much yellow here. So brush bronze wing, but look at these ones. And you'll start to get an idea of the challenge, particularly if you're looking at juveniles. So that's probably the male. You can see the brighter colour on the forehead. It's a brush bronze wing. And then, what's that one?
Yellow on its wing. That's junior.
That's that metallic, the physical coloration coming through. So yeah, just the angle that is right. It's the same feathers, just a different angle. Now the brush bronzewing and the common bronzewing, you can tell their calls apart a bit. So if you hear them in the bush, listen for a while, because remember that the common bronzewing, that was that long and low, and here's the brush bronzewing, if I can make it work. Okay, here's the brush. It's shorter and sharper and a bit more high pitched. Yeah, so that other noise is other birds in the background. Common bronzewing was that was the lower so back. Oom. Yeah, they often feed on caterpillars, and you'll see them. They don't fly into the canopy, they usually fly into the branches under the canopy, and you'll see them looking around for the caterpillars. Really distinctive pattern of flight, and they flick their wings quite distinctively when they land. But when they're flying, you'll see them do sort of 3 wing flaps, or sometimes 2, but typically 3 wing flaps, and they'll climb, and then they'll stop flapping their wings and fall. And then you'll get 3 wing flaps again. So you actually get this movement across the landscape like that. 1, 2, 3, glide. 1, 2, 3. And they sort of shut their wings up a bit. He is, yep. And they have a very distinctive call. Which you often hear. And often heard out on the farmland through this part of the world. Can you all hear that?
I can hear it, but I just say I don't obviously listen. Sounds like a parrot. It sounds a bit like a parrot.
That does, yeah. Not as rich and melodious as a parrot, more grating. Okay, next one. This is another one you often hear all the way across EP, quite often, the call. I'd be surprised if you haven't heard this call. And this is the juvenile. Yeah, I'm sure you've all heard that call. Not as sort of aggressive as a hawk, yeah, but they also have a less commonly heard call. That's the adult male. The female does this. So that's the male. And that's the female. Check the distribution maps. But the typical fantail cuckoo call is that one. You'll hear it all over EP. It'll start in a month or two, and it'll be when. Sometimes they do, but mostly during the day, all day long. So, again, migratory, woodlands, dome-shaped nests, on or close to the ground, so scrub wrens, hedge wrens, fairy wrens, thornbill. It's a big bird compared to a fairy wren and a thornbill. So, look at your... That's a big bird compared to a little wren. No, definitely not a baby. They're migratory down here, and they breed down here, and then they head up north, and they usually have a molt. And up north, they're quite a brown bird. Yeah. So they get their call, their name from their call. Bascombe Wells, about 2 years ago, I was camped out in spring there, and these guys were all around. Dawn chorus was amazing with all sorts of birds, but these were everywhere breeding. And males and the females are browner. Males sit up high and quite distinctive in call. The females, you see them lower in the scrub, much more secretive. So, white-winged triller, and that's, remember we talked about the basic plumage and the alternate plumage? Well, this is the alternate plumage, and they have this while they're breeding, and then they will molt back into the basic plumage, which is, for the males, quite brown. And the females look a lot like this as well, all the time. So very sexually dimorphic. Males very distinct from the females. When they're breeding, when they're not breeding, males very similar. If you're up north, you also have the varied triller to try and tease apart from the white-winged. Northern Australia, yeah. Long way north. And those feathers, that distinct trim right around the edge, do you remember what name that had? So remember we looked at on the early on, we had the names for the different patterns on the feathers? So they're coverts, yes. And remember, just to get the words back into your head, very early on I gave you a chart that showed you the different patterns that we might get on feathers. It's not a... it's not a black fringe, in this case it's a white fringe. But you've got this. So if you're looking at those pictures of the feathers, it's that one. So just to remind you that that sheet exists and start to think about what those feathers are. Right. Fossilbirds. Get them hanging around in groups, typically of about 12, which is where they get their name. 12 apostles, yeah. Not always in 12s, but yeah, that's where they're named. And they're close knit, they always hang around together. Lovely to watch them making their nests, beautiful mud nests. They all get together. And has anyone got Simpson and Dave? Does that show the nest at the back? No, who's? Yeah, that's the one. So no, this doesn't have the nests at the back. Which one is it? Which of the books has the nest at the back? It's not the ones I've given you. Yeah, it does. Yeah. I don't know if the app actually has it. Oh yeah, it does. Yeah, it doesn't show it as well. They're nice, big, round mud nests.
Greg, what was this wing thing you were pointing out?
The feathers before. Looking at the bands.
Oh,
so
okay.
There's the fringing.
Yes, yep, on the end of the feathers.
Yeah,
Yep.
rather than the subterminal fringe. They have the really distinctive brown wings, but the grey with the black in it across the body. They're at the top. They come around past Port Augusta. Do all your maps show that?
No, mine's an old book, remember?
Yeah.
We didn't quite make it that far yet.
Didn't quite make it that far. As you go up into outback New South Wales, along the Darling and into southern Queensland, they're really common. Yeah, that's very distinctive. That you see them on a branch a long way away. They sit out solid on a branch, mud nest. Big bird. Lots of character. Always chatting to each other as they walk across the ground. We had a couple of these recorded around Elliston this year. Normally they don't go past Port Augusta, they head down to Adelaide as they migrate through. But there were a couple around Elliston, so be aware of them. Bigger than a blackbird. Very distinctive, lovely call. The call is where they get their name from. It's onomatopoeic.
An oriole.
Yeah.
Um,
If you're from the East Coast, you know these.
what about,
They're like the fig birds. They're related to the fig birds.
right, so it's called Oriole.
Oriole,
Oh,
yeah.
that's Oriole. I reckon I hear bloody passerine.
Oh, yeah.
Although some birds know.
Catherine. I don't know if they go over there. They're East Coast. Oh, yeah.
No, I was trying to, we had a really loud call in the morning to wake up the children. I was trying to find out what it was. Around Adelaide. Yeah, no, I still don't know what that is was in Catherine. Really loud. Probably something from Papua New Guinea.
Could
Come
be.
down, I don't know.
Yeah. So they're migratory. They move down and round to, you get them sometimes in the Adelaide Hills, not very often. But yeah, they were recorded over here, so be aware of them. Very similar.
Oh, that's that dove thing from the city. The diamond dove.
You must be starting to know the book a bit better than you used to. I mean, you've got to think about how many hours out in the field it would take you to learn the book like this. Years and years and years.
You can write down
Cuckoo, oh my papa. So come up with a mnemonic to help you to remember the call. Some little word association that sticks in your head. We had, in Ethiopia, we had a dove there called the red-eyed dove, and its call was, which the mnemonic for remembering was, I am a red-eyed dove, which nearly killed me in the end, because these birds called all day, all around you, and all you were hearing was, I am a red-eyed dove, I am a red-eyed dove, which the locals, they had a good laugh at that, because they hear it all the time, and it really is everywhere. And they have a whole series of poems written to it, which follow that I am a red-eyed dove, tempo. And so, and the poems, they wrote them down for me. They're beautifully intricate, and they have 3 or 4 different layers, and they talk about a queen going away with a king, and then there's all sorts of intricacies about what you should do as a person in different situations, and all done to that beat, and yeah, and that's what they're saying to this call as they're out working in the fields, hearing this call all day. Quite lovely. But you've got to come up with these ways of helping you to remember it, and I'll talk a lot more about that in a few weeks when we talk about calls and how you use calls. So diamond dove, they're a granivore. So they're going to come in and drink each night. So if you're sitting out in that desert country or further north and you do find a nice little bit of water, go and sit there late afternoon and just watch all the birds come in, and you'll get to see a suite of ones that... Well, they're a granivore, so they eat grain. Yep. So so the grain eaters have to drink daily, whether that be a little finch or whatever. You happen to be able to see the crown here, but the first thing you're seeing is those 2 stripes on the wings. which are the terminal bands on each of the greater coverts and intermediate coverts. You can imagine how similar that looks to the white-browed if you're not seeing the chestnut crown. Yeah.
Sometimes black. Get that, like my hair when I go.
Yeah, the light.
Looks like that orange.
Yeah. Certain angles.
That could trick you, but the double lines give it away.
So, chestnut crown babbler. We all found that? Yep. Good. And then, this is a sound that I associate with Adelaide. On those balmy, warm, sunny afternoons.
That one. Spotted dove. Got spots on the back.
Yeah, that's it. That's Adelaide.
Yeah. There's a few in Port Lincoln. If you go up on the northern edge of Port Lincoln, you'll hear this call.
Are they quite domesticated, or they live in the suburban?
They like the suburban environment in Australia. I haven't heard them much out of cities, to be honest. Yeah. When we're writing introduced species names, typically you'll see that little asterisk at the top of the name. That's telling you it's a non-native. It's come from somewhere else. Okay, so with these guys, I think India is part of their natural distribution. What does it tell you there? China in...
Yeah, Burma, Malaysia. Two races of Burma, Malaysia and China. Introduced in 1860. Hybridised.
Indian turtle dove. Okay.
Oh, okay.
Spotted dove. So if you're in Port Lincoln, just keep an ear out for them, particularly in that Rustler Gully area and up through there. Think about the feathers involved and think about what's happening on each of the individual feathers to create those lines. Yeah. Yep. Everyone's got peaceful dove? Yeah. Again, as you head north, be aware of their presence. And because they're a granivore again, you'll get them around particularly over that summer period, you'll get them around the water holes in the afternoons, evenings. It's just the subspecies here.
Yeah.
Doesn't talk about
The grey butcherbird. Yeah, and the pied, I thought, up at, called Mount Fraser, when we was going to the west.
grey butcherbird, yep. Notice the pied has that really black bib. It comes down along the throat. Can you see the black bib on the throat of the pied? The pied, as you go across towards the Murray, you get the pied and the grey both co-occurring. And with the pied, they have a bit, I like to call it a bit stronger, a bit more melodious. So you get these and the grey both calling through the Murray floodplain area.
Yeah. I reckon it's that one I heard over. Fraser Range.
Twos, sometimes threes. The juvenile is quite brown. They get their name because of the way in which they handle excess prey. So if they've got more little birds than they know what to do with, they'll get a fork of a branch and you'll see them hanging from their head in the fork of the branch. Lizards, they'll do the same, little mice and that sort of thing. The beak has that distinctive hook on the end. They know how to use that. I was banding one once and it just went thock into the top of my thumb. They're very, very strong. So, very powerful bird. Anyway, grey butcherbird. The juveniles are much browner. So that's juvenile plumage. And in the pre-basic molt, where they're going into the adult plumage, you'll get the transition between those two. So be aware of that. Lovely mixture. You don't have to worry about the other butcherbirds until you go much further to the east from here. But over here, it's just the greys.
Yeah, I can call that one from Fraser Range. I heard it.
You've got lots of false names like feral pigeon and things like that, but where their true habitat is this sort of habitat. Yeah, and that's where their proper name comes from. So rock dove is more of an appropriate name. And we've given them beautiful silos as the cliff faces, and we've given them lots of food.
They can be different colours and stuff.
Yeah, because of the breedings that have gone on for centuries. Still introduced. They've actually been the saviour of things like peregrine falcons. They've become a key food source for birds like peregrines. Okay, now the next one is about a group of birds that we often get confused. There's 5 species in Australia, and I've given you a sheet to help you with this a little bit, but we only have 3 of them here. The additional ones are the Teresian crow, which is a northern species, and we also get the forest raven, which is a species that's in Victoria and Tasmania. But over here we don't have those 2 complexities to add to it. We've only got 3 to tease apart. And down here on Lower EP, we've only got ravens. And in Adelaide, there are no crows in Adelaide. The only crows in Adelaide are the footballers. So The Adelaide birds that you hear, they're all little ravens. They were ravens. They were either a little raven or the Australian raven. And their calls are quite similar for the bird. And in fact, they weren't teased apart until the late 70s. They weren't recognised as separate species. They were all thought to be one species.
I'm glad about that. I struggle.
Yeah. And most of the time, when you're identifying these, the best you'll be able to write down is corvid. That's the family they belong to. So you might be able to call them a corvid. If you're lucky, you might be able to split the crows from the ravens. And then if you really hear the right thing or see the right thing, you might be able to split the little raven from the Australian raven or the little crow. And just to talk you through a little bit of the complexity, we'll go through a few things. The little raven, which is the first one there, it's very similar to the Australian raven. And they sort of split them based on measurements and things like that. But when you look, if you do a graph of, say, the size of a little raven, where this is the count, and this might be body size, if you do a graph of that, there's a peak, a mean, where the little ravens, some are bigger and some are smaller, but most are around that mean. And then if you do the same for the Australian raven, the Australian raven's on average just a little bit bigger. But there's a whole lot of Australian ravens that fit into the little raven zone, and there's a whole lot of little ravens that fit in the Australian raven zone. So it's not an easy thing to tell them apart size-wise.
They don't interbreed.
No, they're separate species.
What about their language?
Different.
Where?
They do. They do.
Are they different? Much different from the family?
Their sounds are a bit different, but they overlap again. So it's not as easy as you might hope. The Australian raven, it has the death rattle, but the other ravens and crows also sometimes have a death rattle. So it's not quite as good, but they do both have them. One thing with the little raven, or with both ravens, first of all, the ravens, the feathers underneath the blacker feathers, you will see when the wind blows them up, they're grey. Whereas the crows, when the wind blows them up, you'll see white feathers underneath, or white bases to the feathers. So grey versus white will allow you to split crows versus ravens, but good luck with that one. They both have beards. The beard of the Australian raven's a bit bigger, and if you get an individual feather, they're distinguishable if you're looking at the two feathers. So you can tell them apart, and the Australian raven has a bit more of a throaty bit. So this is a crow, and these two are ravens. Now, that's the little raven. Okay? One thing, if you do see this happen, and you often see it around here, because most of the ones around here are little ravens, when they call, the little raven gives a wing flick. So if you see the bird calling and wing flicking at the same time, probably a little raven. The things that can help you, little ravens, when they're not breeding, will form big groups. So you'll get 20, 50, 100 working across a paddock together. Australian ravens don't do that. They're territorial, and they set up as a pair in the territory, and they spend their life there. If sometimes you might get some young Australian ravens loosely together as a group, but if you've got big groups, they're either a little raven or a little crow. We don't tend to get little crows down south. Every now and then they come down as groups, but mostly they're more northern. So about late summer, early autumn, you often get some little crows coming further south in groups. They do now. They do now and then, but not regularly and not commonly. So the little raven, the type of call and you want to play a few different apps for this. So this is the little raven. They're smart. They're very, very smart. The thing about these guys is that they can go into that longer drawn-out rattle every now and then. Flock call. Okay, so that's the little raven. The Australian raven has that longer drawn-out call. They can take it right down. If you hear that, it's probably Australian raven. But if you hear that first one, little ravens will do that as well. But when you get that really that real death rattle, that's probably the Australian raven. And okay, so they're the two that we get typically down here. These are in pairs and territorial much more. These form pairs while they're breeding and then into bigger groups. Okay, then there's the little crow. Now, white faces to the feathers around the neck and head can be helpful. The little crow, it does something that's quite unique. When it's flying, if it calls while it's flying, it folds its wings up. So as it's going along, you'll see flap, 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 and then you'll hear the call, and then flap, flap, flap again. So you get a little dip as it calls. So if you see that, you've got a little crow. And then, of course, they're in groups. They're a bit smaller, and that can be helpful. So the Australian raven and the little raven are just that little bit bigger. The biggest little crows are about the size of the smallest little ravens, Australian ravens. And they're more northerly typically. Again, if you're in Adelaide, the only bird you'll hear there is the little raven. You don't get Australian ravens in Adelaide. So if you're there, just listen to the calls and you know what you're listening to. And down in the southeast, they're pretty much all little ravens. Sometimes they get an Australian raven up in the Adelaide hills, and there's lots of argument over it, but sometimes. But if you're on the Adelaide plains, it's a little raven. So the crow, this is the little crow. It is slightly different. The Australian raven's more a tenor. It's got a bit more high pitch. These are deeper. And I don't know. It's an interesting one. There's neat research that was done on top of Eyre Peninsula. They found that the little crows up there were regularly avoiding cars, but the little ravens weren't. They're getting hit out on the highways. Yeah, quite interesting. And then if you actually go and look at it, you discover that it's not so much the cars. They avoid the cars, they get hit by the trucks. And they worked it out. They've got the language. They can say car, but they can't say truck. And sorry.
What's the time?
10 minutes. He's getting late. Yeah. be aware of that and have a look through that sheet, because there's lots of information there and it's all about subtleties, and good luck. Okay? I can be confident some of the time with each of the species, and then some of the time it's just a corvid. That's all you can say. So be aware of that. Don't just write down Australian raven on your field surveys, because it might not be. If you know it is, if you've got one of those clues and you're pretty confident and you've started to work it out, go for it.
You pick the threat feather out and you go, well, there you
Yeah,
go.
or you've heard the death rattle, or you've seen them doing the wing flick as they're calling, or they're flying and calling and closing their wings. You know, if you're seeing things that you know are definite, write it down. Great, but just be a bit cautious about what it is that you think you're seeing, and be aware that the pairs or groups are an important part of it as well. You didn't get one? Must have been something you said early on. There you go. And you got one of those as well? A new one? Yeah? Okay. Not behind it? Go for it. Anyone else? Okay, so that sheet's quite useful, and it'll get you to start to think about some of the challenges. And then if you go into Victoria, you're going to have to deal with the forest raven, and if you go up north, you're going to have to deal with the Teresian crow.
Yeah, well, that all around Portland that have these.
Yes.
Forests.
Yeah, and the call is, you can pick the call, but yeah.
Not that I've heard it. There's lots of forest around Portland.
Yes, beautiful forest. That's where I grew up. My favourite part of the world. Uh-huh.
He's on the tug.
Ah.
From Port Lincoln.
Went down there. Dealing. Yep.
14 years ago.
Okay. Yeah, I grew up just west of Portland on a farm, a place called Cashmore. Nice part of the world. Cashmore. If you went out towards Bridgewater, you were near Cashmore. Yeah. Ah, sorry. Yeah.
Where you go out there. And also, your brother made a tape on windjammers and things like that.
No, he's my
Relation.
father's cousin.
Oh,
Yeah.
your relation. Oh,
Yeah.
once removed.
Yes.
And
your cousin too,
Yeah, he's a cousin once removed.
yeah.
Yeah, he's quite a character. Good book.
Really good what he put together.
Yeah. Oh, he's done quite a few, 2 or 3. And tapes, good tapes.
Yeah, tape.
Hmm.
No, CD.
All, how are you going? Got that one worked?
We thought it was a common
No, not a common bronze-wing. Flock. These are more a desert bird, and they move a long way to get their food, and then they'll fly in to get the water, and they might fly 68, 100 kilometres to get water, and they'll take it back to their young, carried in the feathers on their breast and belly.
See, the other unusual thing there is
68, 100 kilometres to come in and get water and then back again.
and here they describe their voice as usually silent.
Yeah. If you look on the app when you get it, there's no call for them. But quite an impressive bird, and they're lovely around a water hole or whatever in the evenings. Male and female, different. And when you see them feeding on the ground, they're really pretty bird. Very, very handsome. Okay. You'll have to organise a trip up to Woodner and meet the Woodner crew and go out, and I'll show you a Jackie Winter or three. Yeah. No. You should be recognising the shape of the head and the bill by now. Yep. This one you don't hear as much on EP, and people get them confused with the Horsfield's bronze because the calls are similar. One's more drawn out than the other.
Black ear. Yeah, black ear.
So, before I talked about the Horsfields, and it was this one is the same sort, but it's drawn out for much longer. And I'll go back for the Horsfields. Where's he gone? There he is. So shorter and sharper. Still descending, triller. And this is the black-eared again. So they're both flattening out, but this going on for much longer. But be aware, they're both out there. The black-eared I haven't heard nearly as often. You hear the Horsfields all the time, but the black-eared is less common. And it's got that very distinctive marking through the eye, but looking at the breast, it doesn't have the bars.
No.
And the tail. Again, the same sort of habits, migratory, domed or enclosed nests, dark brownish eggs, so it concentrates on a different group of species, red throats, scrub wrens, heath wrens and field wrens sometimes. So, black-eared cuckoo, and there's a young one being fed. No, it's one of the field wrens. Okay, 3 minutes ahead of schedule, an early minute. A lovely South Australian phrase. I'd never heard that until I was early minute. When I first started teaching here, I think it was about the first week. Very cheeky, really, when you think about it. Excuse me, sir, can we have an early minute? It's an early minute.